The 1950s are often remembered as an age of consensus, conformity, and prosperity following the trials and tribulations of the Great Depression and World War II. Rising salaries, greater access to education, and high rates of employment all support this perception. But not all Americans shared in the prosperity of the decade, and many who did were still disturbed by the culture of conformity that came with prosperity during the Cold War. Although much of the popular culture of the time celebrated conformity, examples of the growing discontent were easy to find. European writers such as Oswald Spengler, T.S. Eliot, and Aldous Huxley, and American conservative William F. Buckley railed against the excessive materialism and so-called spiritual collapse part and parcel of the decade. In American schools, children practiced duck and cover drills that caused deep anxiety about human helplessness in the face of new technologies of mass destruction. Psychologists worried about rising rates of depression and clinical anxiety among suburbanites, corporate executives, and middle-class women, all beneficiaries of the so-called post-war good life. Suburban housewives, often overextended through domestic work and unrealistic expectations of domestic bliss, suffered high rates of depression. Parents and community leaders grew especially hysterical about children growing into juvenile delinquents. The 1950s white suburban housewife and mother became a Cold War icon as powerful as Rosie the Riveter had been during World War II. Suburban culture and the changing nature of men's work forced many middle-class women to manage the family's needs while husbands were away at jobs, sometimes far from home. Advertisers, religious leaders, and politicians encouraged domestic consumption as the best means for suburban women to participate in public life and to fight communism. Labor-saving appliances provided the centerpieces of suburban households in the 1950s. The newest percolator, range, or vacuum cleaner, advertisements assured, would shave time off a housewife's busy daily routine. The purchase and use of appliances took on a major role in the 1950s. While the husband often earned the income, the wife at least exercised authority over many household purchases and appliances. More than consumers, many suburban women became active dealers of appliances and household goods. Women sold the multicolored plastic Tupperware that filled 1950s cabinets and refrigerators door to door or through Tupperware parties. But these saleswomen were most often paid in Tupperware, not cash, while their male regional managers pocketed large commissions. Likewise, as masters of households, women moved into real estate in increasing numbers and in effect transformed that industry. At home, or in new careers, middle-class women felt pressure to live up to an idealized vision of patriotic femininity. TV moms such as Father Knows Best, Jane Wyatt presented pictures of perfection as they cooked breakfast in designer dresses and were always ready to tend to their family's needs. But despite all the talk of motherhood in the home in the 1950s, many women, especially minority mothers, remained in the workplace and often at low-paying jobs while others entered the workforce for the first time. In 1960, twice as many women held jobs outside the home as they did in 1940. 39% of women with children aged 6 to 17 held paying jobs at the end of 1959. Professional women faced challenges gaining entrance to the best graduate schools and landing good jobs, even with advanced degrees. Even the most accomplished women, such as scientist Rachel Carson, whose prize-winning books The Sea Around Us and Silent Spring became environmental classics, faced prejudice. In Carson's case, industry critics used the media to paint Carson as an emotional woman who worried too much about plants and animals. Women's magazines provided some balance for the majority of American women who did not fit popular stereotypes. Ladies' Home Journal was the most popular magazine in the world in the 1940s and 50s, while other women's magazines such as McCall's, Red Book, and Better Homes and Gardens sold millions. Though filled with advertisements supporting the woman as consumer message, these magazines also offered a forum for more serious discussions of women's issues. Behind what writer Betty Friedan later named the feminine mystique of vacuous suburban domesticity, American women of the 1950s forged new opportunities for themselves while raising awareness of issues that were specific to women and those that reached far beyond the stereotypical suburban household.
Girls are kind of lucky, don't they, Mom?
Why do you say that?
Well, they don't have to be smart. They don't have to get jobs or anything. All they gotta do is get married.
Middle-class affluence and extended education created a new category in American life in the 1950s, the teenager who had money to spend and the power to influence popular culture. During the 1950s, teenagers emerged as a distinct consumer group. By decade's end, this influential demographic actively shaped American culture. As early as 1944, with the publication of 17 magazine, ads aimed specifically at teens began to appear often. By the 1950s, teens, driving sales of records and fashion, were the most sought-after market segment. By the 1960s, with an average income of $10 per week, teens contributed more than $10 billion to the U.S. economy. Early teen advertisements and TV shows tended to portray teens as clean-cut, wholesome, middle-class, and white. While marketers embraced these new consumers, cultural critics, parents, and law enforcement officials worried about the growing cultural influence of teenagers and their rebellious tendencies. Rock and roll emerged in the early 1950s as Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Little Richard, and other black musicians mixed the musical traditions of gospel and rhythm and blues into a new, unique form of distinctly American music. Black musicians, gaining popularity among white teens, launched a musical revolution with lasting social consequences. By the mid-1950s, young white dudes such as Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis repackaged the music emerging from the black community and made it acceptable for a much wider white audience. Elvis Presley's meteoric rise began at the humble Memphis Sun Records in 1955. By September of the next year, he was signed to RCA's label and was selling records by the millions. Early media reactions to Elvis range from characterizations of him as vulgar and suggestive to racially coded claims that he was a purveyor of a, quote, Aborigines mating dance. Parents, along with religious and political leaders, viewed the music and the reactions it caused as dangerously subversive. Despite concerted community and national efforts to ban the new music, teens embraced the rebellious and sexually charged rock and roll with fanatical fervor. Popular films of the 1950s dramatized teenage troubles and contributed to popular anxieties about youth. Movies, especially the Wild Ones in 1953, Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, and Blackboard Jungle in 1955, marked a stark departure from the patriotic offerings of the war years. Featuring Marlon Brando, James Dean, and Sidney Poitier as angry nonconformists, these films celebrated rebellion as well as contempt for parents and social institutions. Likewise, Leonard Bernstein's Broadway hit West Side Story celebrated ethnic diversity and youth rebellion. Mild by later standards, these productions, along with books like J.D. Salinger's hugely popular 1951 bestseller, Catcher in the Rye, frightened critics who rightly assumed that the buying power and sheer numbers of teenagers had led to the creation of an influential subculture. Teenagers were not alone in using popular culture to express their discontent with Cold War culture. Much like the Lost Generation writers of the 1920s, beatniks, or beat slang for down-and-out writers such as Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William S. Burroughs looked at post-war American society and did not like what they saw. Beats celebrated nonconformity and experimentation. Sexual experimentation, rootless travel, and anger permeated Kerouac's On the Road and Burroughs' Naked Lunch. Photographer Robert Frank added visuals to the critique with his bleak 1959 portrait of the nation, the Americans. By calling into question America's traditional values, 1950s nonconformists had taken the first steps toward a critical collaboration between alienated progressive whites and black civil rights activists.